For dev, the question is more on market imperfections versus institutional imperfections. I think all the reasons you pointed out why having some mechanism that addresses the liquidity constraints of why people are not having the right food and therefore cannot be productive, or insurance, and so giving you some certainty and allowing you to take risk and to move, can have an efficiency gain. Now that is clear. But mobilizing resources also has an efficiency cost, and we know that the marginal tax burden, every time we transfer a rupee from one part to the other of the economy, we are destroying economic activity perhaps to maybe 30 to 70 cents of a rupee. And so if I think of insurance imperfections and the certainty equivalent of removing the risk, I'm not sure that I get into the 30 to 70 cents per rupee. So the question is not whether it's plausible that there are efficiency gains, but whether the efficiency gains are big enough to compensate the cost of mobilizing resources. And finally, for Helmut, I very much like the account of RSBY. Again, I was many years in Vietnam where there was a lot of progress on the health insurance for the poor, which had many similarities and has been very effective. But one of the challenges for societies that are in a very rapid demographic transition, like Vietnam or India, is that they will also be aging very rapidly. And therefore the issue of becoming old before they become rich as societies is a big challenge. And so the question for Helmut is there anything equivalent to RSBY that can be envisioned to address pension and not just health moving forward? So let me now go back to the initial order and start with Albert.
Let me just respond to your question, Martin. So yeah, I think we have to be clear about the objectives of government organized pension programs. And one is a minimum kind of old age security argument, which is very similar to a poverty reduction argument. And the second is a smoothing argument, that you want people to enjoy a consumption level similar to the income earning years, and facilitate a mechanism where people can accomplish those goals related to longevity. You actually don't need a universal pension to accommodate the first goal, because you can just have a targeted poverty subsidy program. And so a minimum pension kind of mixes both goals. It helps everybody, including the poor, but it also helps people trying to smooth their income, but only so much, especially for rich people. My view is that maybe is a reasonable trade-off for a country that's not extremely rich and has to make tough decisions. At the same time, it seems like there should be other ways to add additional programs. And I know Levy, in a paper I read, proposed, because of this objection, proposed that you could add an additional kind of contribution system for formal sector workers or certain groups of workers. Or perhaps you could do a voluntary system, like in the US, where you have a Social Security system that does a more basic kind of role, but is not universal, obviously. It's still based on contribution. But then a lot of different employer-run pension programs where workers really see the value and so are incentivized to contribute and value that as kind of part of their compensation packages. But those are just a few reactions.
Yeah, very, very, very good questions. Let me also comment on that one, because both are linked. The question you posed to Albert and the one you posed to me. I also, we've debated this with Santiago, do not think his model is simply viable, because he doesn't separate in the policy analysis what it is having anti-poverty programs and programs for consumption smoothing. And programs for consumption smoothing, if you think about it, the level of smoothing that is required, or the level of benefit, the replacement rate, goes up with income. So first of all, you need to separate both of them. We can have something to deal with poverty, and it's very basic. That will not address the problem of how do I smooth my consumption, because there are imperfections in the market and because my own limitations as a human being. I would not, however, redistribute income to address consumption smoothing, because that can be very regressive. That can be extremely regressive. It means that my contributions or my subsidies have to be going up with the level of income. Brings me to the other problem. If you're trying to address these market failures, why we intervene in insurance markets or we try to promote savings, right? I mentioned these essentially three things. The liquidity, which is related to the poverty, the access, and you added failures in annuity market, but it's essentially imperfections in the financial system, right? I don't have the banks or savings accounts that I can trust, or I don't have annuity markets. And then the behavioral problems. So the question I ask is, liquidity, we all agree we need some type of subsidy. For access, we need to have regulations that improve, make banks safer, expand the outreach to rural areas, mobile technology that facilitate access. We can have regulations to develop annuity markets. The question is how you deal with the last one, behavioral. And there are one way we have been doing this over the years is by command and control. Since I don't trust you guys, you are going to be able to save enough, I ask you all are going to save now 15% or 20%, whatever it is. And first of all, that can go so far. The people you can really impose to, because otherwise there are penalties. You cannot impose that on everybody. Even among them, I don't think it's the right response, because why is that we have different preferences, different needs, different family size, different ages. Why both of us have to contribute 20% in the pension system? Doesn't make any sense. So is that mandatory part of this market system that I think needs to be reviewed? And I believe that some of these nudges and incentives are the alternative to that. Better information. Information is key. Nudges, reminders, and probably to some extent financial incentives to some extent.
Yeah, okay, this is an interesting question which Martin has posed. Just a couple of points, I'll have to think about it more, but one is that of course India has, as it is a very low tax revenue to GDP ratio, even for a comparable GDP or per capita, it's very low. So there's a big scope for increasing that on many grounds. Secondly, there's also scope for reducing a number of subsidies which should not be there, which fortunately a couple of them have gone because of the favorable oil price situation. So they've been able to get rid of that diesel subsidy which was there. So you can have redistribution within the taxation or within the revenue system without having to collect additional, but there's a scope for additional. Third is that one has to think of what would otherwise be the uses of that money, which would be coming into the tax system. And if it were just something that's going into savings, then one might put it at just calculated at the bank rate of interest that you would get, and you would not have maybe the 30 to 70% kind of ratio. But anyway, I agree. What the question that you've posed is interesting, something to be looked into.
Last one. With not so good news, because there's, as I see it, no equivalent to address pension. There's nothing working here in India. There is a contributory scheme called NPS Lite for the informal sector with matching grants from government, but the uptake actually is very low for, I would say, various reasons. One is bad marketing. Another one is too little flexibility within the scheme, so that in case of need that you can withdraw again some of the money. And also, of course, a lack of trust in the financial sector. And actually what David presented was very interesting to me. Also this question on how you actually can trigger behavioral change, because that would be definitely needed in India. We have this current initiative of the new government to open up bank accounts for everybody in India. This might at least at a later stage serve as a basis for better savings and pension schemes, but at the moment I also do not see much interest of the government in establishing something, and I think this is actually very unfortunate, because if you look at the demographic development of India, in 30 to 40 years we will be in India where we are currently in China.
And it is high time to think about a pension system if we do not want to have a situation here which is even much more devastating than in China.
So let me just thank everybody for what has been a very rich discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
We have a 15-minute break and then we'll convene for the last session. Yeah, Dr. Campbell is already here. The Dasha, please, could you please come to the stage? You're here, and Dr. Chona Ishaves. Yeah, hi. Nisha. Nisha is not here yet.
She was here a second ago.
Oh, great. So I'm going to give the mic to Dr. Duncan Campbell. Dr. Campbell, please.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to the last panel of 2 very rich days of discussion on the topic of jobs and development. I'm going to take just 5 minutes to introduce the panel, and then we'll get right started. Each panelist has a maximum of 15 minutes to speak. And the title of this is Labor Practices in South Asia. Now, on the one hand, that might imply something homogeneous or monolithic. You will find out that's not the case at all. Our first panelist is Dasha Bima Wangda. He's the secretary from the Ministry of Labor and Human Resources in Bhutan. Gross national happiness. It has been the major policy since the 1970s in the Kingdom of Bhutan. And I quote, it promotes conditions that promote citizens to pursue happiness. The ultimate goal of governance is to create conditions of well-being and happiness. So we'll look forward to hearing his elaboration of that. The next speaker will be Dr. Bandita Sijapati, and she is research director at the Center for the Study of Labor and Mobility in Nepal. Now, she'll note that progress has been made in Nepal since the return to peace in 2006, but the country is experiencing significant demographic shifts, structural transformation of the economy, which might be called negative structural transformation of the economy, involving a shrinking industrial and export base, large-scale out-migration of Nepalese workers, Nepalese young people. Our third speaker is Dr. Chona Chavez, who is Deputy Director of Research at the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, and this one will be on women's employment in Afghanistan. And she notes that it's one of the most extreme cases of gender inequality in the world. There might be a labor force participation rate of females in the Afghan labor force of 8% only. So we'll look forward to hearing the reasons for that. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Nisha Arunatalake, excuse my pronunciation, research fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. She's going to address the notion of unemployment rate declines as looking good, but the labor force participation rate has also declined, and the employed population is only 52% in Sri Lanka. Public sector, as has been the case in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, is still a very attractive source of entry into the labor market, as is, in a growing sense, outward migration. Outward migration from Sri Lanka has always been fairly substantial. Our fifth speaker will be Dr. Deb Kusum Das, who's a reader in the Department of Economics at Ramjas College, University of Delhi. He will be posing a question related to labor regulation, labor law. And he's going to say whether jobless growth has been the result of the stringencies of India's labor laws? Do they prevent, for example, the growth of manufacturing? So the question will be, does the Indian labor law framework result in the growth of contract labor because of the stringencies applied to labor who are permanent employees? And finally, we have as our discussant Dr. Edgar Rodriguez. He's the senior program officer, specialist in the Inclusive Growth Program at the IDRC in Canada, the International Development Research Center. And we'll turn it over to him after our speakers have concluded. So let me conclude by saying that I look forward to this panel. I look forward to the diversity that comes from my brief introduction of all of these people, and welcome panelists. So let us begin with you, sir.
Good evening, everybody. As introduced, I am from Bhutan, a very small country compared to most of the countries in South Asia, but a country that thinks very big. So, a word of caution, although I am going to make a presentation on the happiness and unemployment, a case study from Bhutan, and then I will be talking a little bit about gross national happiness, but I'm not a specialist on happiness and gross national happiness, and I have seen that many thinkers are also not able to find any solution to this happiness business. So don't ask me questions on happiness and gross national happiness. Ask me on labor market and employment. So with this, may I begin? Well, my presentation will be a little bit on gross national happiness, then survey findings on the unemployment and happiness, the correlation between unemployment and happiness, and employment policy of the royal government of Bhutan, and survey findings from the National Labour Force Survey on unemployment situation in the country, and current initiatives by the royal government. Well, I'm sure those of you who have interest in gross national happiness, which has been declared on March 20 of every year is declared as International Day of Happiness, and this was a UN resolution sponsored by Bhutan in 2011 and supported by 69 member countries. And the concept of gross national happiness was, of course, promulgated by the fourth king in 1972. And he said gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. And the king who abdicated his throne at the age of 54 in favor of his son. So we now have the fifth king who says the beneficial development of human society takes place when material and spiritual development occurs side by side to complement and reinforce each other. The Constitution of Bhutan 2008, Article 9, states that the state shall strive to promote those conditions that will enable the pursuit of gross national happiness. The goal for GNH, the gross national happiness, is to improve conditions for good physical and mental health, high spirituality, good education, clean environment, vibrant community, strong and vibrant culture, good governance, decent standard of living, and work-life balance. So the GNH has 9 domains. First, psychological well-being, health, time use, education, cultural diversity and resilience, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity and resilience, living standards. Survey findings on happiness. In 2010, a national survey was carried out by the Center for Bhutan Studies, in which happiness and other well-being GNH indicators were included. The survey result indicated that there was a very strong correlation between employment and happiness. So from the scale of 0 to 10, one question asked was, how happy do you consider yourself to be? And of course, obviously, unemployed were lesser happy and employed were more happy. Then, of course, how do you rate your quality of life? And then, of course, it is again obvious that unemployed people were have lesser quality of life, and employed have better quality of life. In general, how you rate your health status? And again, unemployed had employed had better status of health, and unemployed had less. Number of healthy days reported in the past 1 month, unemployed had lesser number, employed had more. Stress level, of course, unemployed had more stress than employed people. Then of those who had suicidal thoughts in the past 12 months, 63 were unemployed. So amongst the Bhutanese who thought of committing suicide, 63% of them were people who had no jobs, who were not employed. So why gainful employment is important then to a country that is promoting gross national happiness? Gainful employment is one of the most effective ways to increase happiness and well-being of individuals, their families, their communities, and the nation at large. So I'm sure that everybody knows about this, and it is very obvious. Employment, especially long-term employment and job stability, is one of the most obvious causes of satisfaction in life. This was said by the OECD's chief media officer. I just looked at the internet and found this one. Why gainful employment of Bhutanese is crucial to the government of Bhutan. In Bhutan, unemployment has much more ramifications as the extended family or joint family system is very strong, is still very strong. For example, if one Bhutanese is unemployed, not only his or her parents, siblings, but also his relatives like uncles, aunties, and in some cases even his or her friends are obliged to support him. So we have now a situation in Bhutan where the young men and women are choose to remain unemployed rather than looking for a job, because if they remain unemployed, if they are not able to find the job they like, there are a lot of people who support him or her. So they can choose to remain unemployed. But if a person, if a Bhutanese is unemployed, because of this support system that is there, of course, those who are supporting him or her are unhappy. So we estimate that around 20 Bhutanese are unhappy if one Bhutanese is unemployed because of the network that we still exist. So currently, you will find some of the figures laughable because we are a very small country, so we have very small figures compared to India, even Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and our neighboring countries. So currently, we have around 10,000 Bhutanese, mostly young men and women, school leavers and university graduates, who are unemployed, and the current unemployment rate is 2.9% of the total labor force. This means that around 200,000 Bhutanese, which works out to 27% of the population, because our population is only about 745,000. So if 10,000, because 10,000 Bhutanese are unemployed, we estimate about 2 lakhs or 200,000 Bhutanese are unhappy. And that consists of about 20%, 7% of the population. And this situation we find unacceptable in a GNH country, a country that has adopted gross national happiness as its development philosophy. So now the challenge, there are very big challenges that the country is faced with. An estimated 120,000 new job seekers, mainly school leavers, university graduates, are expected to enter the labor market during the current 5-year plan. And out of that, 82,000 new jobs need to be created by the economy to meet the target of full employment. That is 97.5% of the Bhutan's labor force. This is what the current government has pledged to full employment. So for a small country with a small economy, so we have a very small economy. I believe our economic size is only $1 billion, which is also facing economic downturn like most of the countries. It is by no means an easy task to create jobs for 82,000 new workers. So what are we doing, trying to do to fulfill the target or the promise made by the government of full employment? So the Royal Government of Bhutan has recently approved the National Employment Policy and declared, of course, as I said, full employment for 97.5% of the total labor force. And full employment is also one of the 16 key result areas of the current 5-year plan that we are currently implementing, 11 5-year plan. An economic stimulus plan of new 5 billion, equivalent to 5 billion rupees, has been approved, out of which 550 million is allocated for pre-employment activities. So I'm just trying to show this to indicate, just to show you that how much importance the government is giving on employment creation and resolving and tackling unemployment situation in Bhutan. Of course, development of 3 industrial estates have been approved and work will begin soon. Skills development for job seekers, both for domestic and international labor market, and school-based career counseling for students as well as job seekers, overseas employment in selected countries. So we have introduced this for the first time because we have a labor force of 335,000 out of 700,000 people, and it was not logical to think of exporting Bhutanese to work outside. But now, because of this growing unemployment problem, we have introduced overseas employment program last year. Guaranteed employment program for school leavers and university graduates. Thank you for your kind attention. I finished 2 minutes ahead of the allotted time.
Thank you. So we're moving from one small country to another one. I would like to begin by thanking ICRIER for giving me this opportunity to not only share findings from Nepal. They're not actually findings, they're more like the current state of affairs in Nepal. But more than that, the opportunity to really learn from the rich discussions that we have had in the past 2 days. Like I mentioned, I was thinking about, and we talked about this with Nisha as well. We were just thinking about what to present in this 15-minute slot, and it is a challenging task. So what I thought I focus on is to just give you a brief overview about the current status of labor, employment, jobs issues in Nepal. For people who might not be very well aware, Nepal is a small country in terms of the geographical space, but definitely not in terms of the population size, especially when compared to Bhutan. The total population is about 28 million. The population has been increasing over the years, but the growth rate has decreased significantly in the past 10 years. From 2.25% in 2001 to 1.35% in 2011. The economy is small. The total GDP is about 19.3%, sorry, $3 billion, and per capita GDP of 750. With compared to other countries in South Asia, the growth rate in Nepal has been very sluggish. Averaging about 3.8% in the past 10 years. It is one of the poorest countries in the world. According to HDI index, Nepal ranked about 157 out of 187 countries that were included. However, the proportion of poor in Nepal has been decreasing significantly. Dilip Ratha in the morning pointed to the statistics from 42% in 1995-96, that's the percentage of people who were below the poverty line, to about 25% in 2010-11. Concurrent with the reduction in poverty is also the reduction in inequality, which has reduced from 41% to 35%, according to the recent figures. Nepal emerged from 10 years of violent conflict, which ended in 2006, but there has been a period of prolonged political transition. And since the time we got democracy in 1990 until now, we've had 20 different governments. So the legacy of conflict still remains. In terms of the broader structure of the economy, there has been a major shift until 1980s, until late 1980s actually. Nepal was predominantly an agricultural country, with agriculture contributing to more than 80% of the GDP, but now that has shifted significantly, and currently it's the services sector which contributes, which has the highest proportion of, contributes the most to the GDP, ranging about 50%, and agriculture has gone down to 39%. But there are two things that are particularly important in this regard. One is that even though, despite the shift from agriculture to services sector, the agriculture sector still contributes to about 3/4 of total employment in Nepal. So there is that mismatch that was also talked about yesterday. The other thing is that because the agriculture sector, so basically the economy leapfrogged the manufacturing sector, what that has basically meant is that it has become much more difficult for low-skilled and people with low levels of education to get employment opportunities. But what we see also recently, looking more closely at these figures, is that in the agriculture sector, there has been shift from food production, basic food production, to cash crops. So that means that there is the possibility of improvements in labor productivity in the agriculture, of improving productivity in the agriculture sector. So it is likely that agriculture will still remain as a cornerstone of labor, of employment and development in Nepal in the years to come. In terms of some of the key features of the Nepali labor force, there's very high numbers of people in the lower age cohorts. So people below the age of 35 account for about 70% of the total population. So the supply pressures are strong. The literacy levels are still low, relatively low, but it has been increasing. So 60% in 2010 compared to 51% in 2003, 2004. But there are, despite these improvements in literacy, there are still significant differences that, especially across different groups. So female literacy is 20% lower than male literacy rates. Rural areas, of course, fare much worse than urban areas, and literacy rates in the poorest wealth quintile is half that you find in the richest quintile. As you see in most other developing countries, the illiterate people are the ones with highest rates of employment, and this does not mean anything besides the fact that poor people do not have an option but to work. So that's why you see employment rates being high for them. But over the years, what we also see is that employment rates have been increasing for people with higher levels of education as well. And there has been an increase in wage premiums for people with higher secondary and tertiary education. So that's one of the good things to look for. In terms of what the conflict has done to the economy, one thing, of course, is that it has delayed the transition of the workforce outside of agriculture. But then there are a few findings that I think are particularly important. One is that this is a study that was conducted with the support from the World Bank, which showed that in high conflict areas, the proportion of working age population that were employed increased from pre-conflict years to conflict years, which in a way sounds counterintuitive, but that's what the results showed. And what that probably means for the economy is that this increase in labor supply, despite the decrease in demand, means that the equilibrium wages has gone down, and the standards of living has also declined. The other the other important finding that came out from this study is that in high conflict areas, the proportion of working age women increased more than the proportion of working age men. And this can be explained by the simple fact that because of conflict, men were either had fled the areas, were killed, had left their families. So because of that, there was the added effect, added worker effect in that the women started joining the labor force in greater numbers. It's a remittance-driven economy. 53% of households in Nepal either have at least one absentee or a returnee who is living within the country or outside. Two-thirds of men in the working age category are actually working outside the country. Between 2001 and 2011, there was a more than twofold increase in the number of Nepalis who were living outside the country, and the effects of this kind of movement has been enormous. Remittances account for 30% of the country's GDP. Of course, the outmigration has had an equalizing effects on the labor markets in terms of reducing the labor supply pressures. But what we see is that the outmigration has been so great that probably it is, in a positive way, it is causing women to enter the labor force. But what we also see is that one of the negative unintended consequences is that there has been an increase in child labor. And the real wages, along with the supply, labor supply issue that I mentioned, is that real wages has been increasing, and this is probably one of the reasons why we've seen a decrease in poverty levels. But I think in terms of the poverty, decrease in poverty levels, one thing to think about is that it's definitely not a reduction that was caused by economic growth, but rather it was a reduction that was caused by remittances inflow. Quality of jobs is a concern. Approximately 96% of the workers are employed in the informal sector, and informal employment is pervasive across all sectors. Why this is important is that poverty rates among regular wage or salaried workers is found to be 3 times less than that for casual workers. Unemployment rates are low. 2.2%. Compared to other global figures, but that does not mean that it's good form of employment or quality employment, because 30% of those who are employed are underemployed, and this probably explains the 74% of people being employed in the agriculture sector despite their free will. The labor force participation, as I mentioned before, is fairly high in Nepal, and over the years has been increasing. And while 90% of those children who are working are contributing family members, who are of course not paid, almost 51%, more than 50% of them would qualify as being child laborers according to ILO standards. There's also significant disparity in cash earnings between those working in the agriculture and non-agricultural sector, as well as between males and females. So while in the case of agricultural and non-agricultural sector, you could explain the wage difference in terms of sectoral productivity for male and female, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It's it's a sure case of gender discrimination. Labor force participation of women is high, something that is often talked about in reference to Nepal, but 96% of those females are employed in the informal sector. And like I said before, wage differentials are very significant between men and women. Every year there are about 500 youths who appear for class 10 examination called the school leaving certificate. And that is considered to be the iron gate in Nepal in terms of being able to enter into the labor market. But less than, that's not a ring for me, is it? Not yet. 1 minute. Okay. And but more than 50% of those who appear for the examination fail. And this cohort, you would imagine, would want to get some kind of vocational education or some kind of technical training. And there are two issues that I would like to point to in terms of these figures. One is that the capacity of the training institutions that we have right now is very limited. Every year, on an average, they produce about 62,000 graduates, which is much less than the demand in terms of, even if we say 50% fail, that's about 300,000 people who would want to benefit from vocational education but are unable to do so. The other issue is the donor dependency. 36% of these training institutions are supported by donor-funded projects. So the lifespan of these are fairly small, and this kind of dependency, of course, is not a positive sign. The other is the sectoral distribution of the kind of trainings that people take. Most of it is 23% is in livelihoods, and what that basically means is trainings in goat rearing, and small in vegetable farmings, activities that would actually promote self-employment. And we've already talked about the challenges with increasing levels of self-employment, so I won't get into that. Very quickly, the labor market policies, as in other countries, is very stringent, but then the protection of workers is not there. Only 3.4% of workers in Nepal are covered by the existing social security schemes these initiatives. The other issue that I wanted to raise is that labor density, union density in Nepal, range from 29% to 75%, depending on what kind of sector you're talking about. But labor unions in Nepal are very fragmented. There are about 200 plus national level trade unions that have been registered at the Department of Labor. They're very politicized, owing to the history where trade union movements and political movements went side by side. And there are very different there are different kinds of measures that firms have used to circumvent statutory laws in Nepal, and one of them that I would like you to think about is this process of hiring foreign workers. So in Nepal currently, according to the 2011 census, there are about 150 immigrants, about 90% of whom are Indians from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So we have this funny process where Nepali workers who go abroad for employment opportunities, and we have people from other countries, primarily India, coming into the country for employment. I will stop there. I was just going to summarize, which I'll leave to later.
Okay, let's move slightly west to Afghanistan. We'll hear from Dr. Shona.
Sorry. You're tall, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. It is both a pleasure and a privilege to come over and share what my organization knows about Afghanistan. At the beginning, I was a bit ambitious that I thought that I can get hold of the data that I want to, but because this sharing is based from a scoping study on South Asian countries, but I later found out that there are just so many data that's lacking when I focus into Afghanistan. So I used instead our own information mapping study that was funded by UN Women from 2002 to 2012 on women's economic empowerment, as well as a study that looked into the girls' education by BRAC in Afghanistan that's offering livelihood training and life skills, hoping that these girls aged 14 or 15 to 20 or 24 will be able to enter into the labor market, earn an income, and gain economic empowerment. So my sharing will be based on this from these studies. Those are pictures of the women. These are part of the cover that we had in our publications. By the way, AREU is an Afghan-based organization in Afghanistan. It's only, it has no headquarters. It's just in Afghanistan. And we've been, since 1998, but we've been registered as an Afghan organization in 2002. And for the first time, also at the, last year, we have an Afghan director leading the organization, and also an Afghan deputy director for communication. So it's a bit like going into being Afghanized. That's where we are at AREU, and we have a we are proud of a library that houses so many information about Afghanistan. So, and that's where we are. In the 8 SAARC countries. And then just a few, very quickly, I'll just walk through with you very quickly on where we are when it comes to data. We are close to Nepal when it comes to population, but lower. We are 26.9. And then the HDI rank is 169. A bit higher than the Sub-Saharan Africa and also the Arab. And then we have the our GII, which is 0.705, and we rank 150. I'm saying we. So I think I've mentioned about this, that we are going to take a look on the accompanying challenges and opportunities that can currently go with the employment of women in Afghanistan or joining into the labor market. And then that's the basis of this, the data that I am sharing. And I am not saying that there's nothing going on in Afghanistan. Research indicates that the achievements of the past decade are many, but however, they pale in comparison when you compared for the last 3 decades of instability. So we have this. We have minimum infrastructure, serious economic and socio-political challenges brought about by insecurity and instability. Women were recipient in bearing the brunt as an affected and increased violence, denial of their rights, and lack of opportunities. This is from the literature. And then 16% of the female above age 15 participated in the labor force in 2011 compared to 77% for men. It's really low. Then within its non-working age population was nearly 50% with 11.5 million under age of 15. I'm not sure if this is still true, the highest in the world. And then 0.75 million over 65 years old. So it really has a very high dependency ratio. With 2.8% annual population growth rate, where Nepal now has 1.2, and 6% of women over 25 years had access to some type of formal education, but 88% of women over 15 years remained illiterate. So that's 88%. In the rural areas, where more than 70% of the population resides, an estimated 90% of women and 63% of men are illiterate. So, the primary school enrollment for girls seems to have received more attention, with 39.1% of the primary schools, 33.2% of the secondary schools, and 28.1% of the higher secondary schools having been designated female only. This might be low to other countries, but this is a marked improvement for the past 10 years. So, gender is considered a key factor affecting accessibility to resources, services, and opportunities, thus mediating access to employment and income-generating activities. So despite this immense involvement of the international organizations, still, women are more disadvantaged than men in terms of their ability to receive skills and education, access to productive resources, and assets and work outside their homes. And statistics will bear this, as the one that I presented earlier on. So, the ARU's research results show 4 chief areas of action and intervention that could address women's ongoing and equal access to economic opportunities. These are especially in education, health, economic empowerment, and religious affairs. Of course, this cannot be done overnight. It will take quite some time. So, strengthening the policy environment, Afghanistan has a NAPWA. It's a National Action Plan for Women in Afghanistan. But its implementation is really very slow. And even until now, the indicators are still being reclassified. So it was formulated in 2008. It has targets already for 2013. And then, of course, the Afghanistan National Development Strategies. Addressing human development gaps, it is crucial to address the gaps that girls and women face in education and educational facilities, healthcare provision, and in access to safety, physical mobility, and political participation. One road to take is to provide facilities that are women-oriented and then gender segregated. There are questions on this, and perhaps we can discuss about this particular thing. Focusing on deliverables, it is necessary to create a strong and active network of and for women across sectors that operates at the pan-Afghanistan levels, in cities and provincial headquarters to build a women-to-women service delivery model, and entrepreneurship among women with focus on the domestic market and export potential. Then, engendering the financial services. Access to credit and capital is essential to widen and enhance women's economic engagement. But women have extremely limited access to substantial credit or capital, even their access to their land, because it's an issue of who will inherit the land. They lack insurance and risk guarantee. In the current microfinance climate, they also face high interest rates and small credits coupled with tight repayment schedules. Simultaneously, the reach of the microfinance sector is limited when compared to the demand and is of fairly standard nature, which does not always cater to the needs of women in the rural informal sector and in small-scale trade. And in our case studies, we even found out that even for those solely for women, microfinance, in the end, they are not the ones using it. It's just their name, but it's either the husband or the son who will be making use of the money that's being accessed in the microfinance for women. So I would like to go into that adolescent reading centers, life skills and livelihood training, because this is a case, if there are just so many initiatives on training women, and especially girls, who are out of school by giving them livelihood training and also life skills. So I would like to share what we learned from this particular study. So the research identified limited effectiveness of the training to teach adequate skills that have contributed to the limited income generating outcomes of the tailoring course of the livelihood training. There are just so many tailoring courses being offered in the different villages in Afghanistan. And then that's what we found out, that the aim was for them to be able to earn an income out of the training that were given to them. But because they were being treated homogeneously, like there was no like clear what were their skills before. So we found out that only those who have the previous skills, like who had an initial skills already before they entered into the training, that were able to gain something out of the training. The rest, it was not. However, there was something on it about when it comes to the relationship in the family. Like learning, like on health issues, more or less gave them being acknowledged as something that they have knowledge on that particular area. But converting that into income, there was not. No? So, for instance, like tailoring appears to be less demanding as women can set up their business at home. It, however, will require access to capital to purchase sewing machines, fabric, and other required materials. So this was not taken into consideration. This can be difficult as women face restrictions on working in public rather than in male-dominated areas and may not be able to make a male relative who is available to market their produce. So mobility to go outside of their homes and their village is an issue. So, and then when we also went into looking at these girls who were dropped outs, it's not about, the main reason given is not about security. 70% of the sample was more because of the restriction of the male members of the family for them not to go out. So, I would like to go, okay. When it comes to the training, like the livelihood training, we looked into ensuring effective content and delivery. And then linking, not just the training aspect, but linking them into the market. Because there was also one in our situation analysis that really worked, but it was because, and it was just 1 out of the 5 cases that indeed women were earning an income because there was a clear link into the market. So, but there are a lot of like training activities not linked into the market. Enhance teaching and learning outcomes, focus on marketable skills, then connect girls, students, female teachers, women community members and association where possible and appropriate. And for them also to have like, if there are champions for these women among the men who can really like vouch for them in the community. Facilitate safe access to training by establishing training centers appropriate and nearby locations where possible by providing transport and dormitories because it's really an issue. Other than that, there should be a focus on men because gender inequalities cannot be addressed without establishing an enabling environment for men to support greater women's roles and position in the society. Because, as I mentioned, it was always the men prohibiting the women, girl or older women, to go out. Integrate plan and support for women in light of their unpaid and caring responsibility by offering childcare and other services. I think I don't have the time anymore, but I can share more of this when there are questions and expound on this. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jana. I'd like to thank all the three speakers for keeping to time. We now move to, where do we move to? Dr. Nisha Aruntalilake. Sorry, I can't do that.
Hi, I'm Nisha Arunatilaka. Yes. Thank you. In many sense, Sri Lankan labor market, the performance of the Sri Lankan labor market is very good.